Muy buenos días a todas y a todos. Bom dia a todas y a todos. Good morning to everyone, and welcome to the third of the Task Force on Net Zero Policy events here in the Spanish Pavilion. Today we're going to talk about the section of the report that we just published 2 days ago that deals with transition planning policies around the G20 and beyond. But for those who do not know the Task Force Net Zero Policy, let me tell you very briefly what it is. The Task Force on Net Zero Policy was set up as a sort of like a spin-off of the UN Secretary General high-level expert group on net zero pledges of non-state actors. Its aim is to look at and examine policies around the G20 and beyond that are aimed at steering companies, large companies and financial institutions into implementing credible transition pathways. Now, every year we produce a report and we hand over to the Secretary General at COP. And we're very happy to have with us today a member of the task force, Nick Robbins, from the World Resource Institute and previously the London School of Economics, and Renko Fischer from the UNEP-FI. UNEP-FI sits on our board. So thank you so much for all the support that you've given throughout these years to the task force. Now, this year's report, we decided to do a deep dive in 4 issues. One of them was, as I was mentioning, the policies and regulation that have been developing around, across the G20, on transition plans or transition planning elements. And I want to share with you before we start the discussion and I introduce you the rest of our panel today, the 3 key findings or takeaways of our report. The first one is that we've seen that transition plans, together with taxonomies, are emerging like the key tools for transition planning, for transition finance, So the key tools for investors to use in order to provide, transition finance. Now, really interesting, what we've seen is that across the G20, there are 14 jurisdictions that have 1 or more policy measures that require the disclosure of emission reduction targets, and 13 of them of transition plans. Now, if we go, broader and we look at 37 jurisdictions, including the G20, and now I have to look at my notes, we have identified 27 tools across 37 jurisdictions. And 50 of those were adopted in 2024 and 2025. So if we would look at the policy development over the years, we've seen that over the last 2 years, there's been a peak. Further, that despite all the backlash in the US and the latest news coming from Brussels, the rest of the world has continued developing policies in this area. So today we're going to deconstruct that part of the report. And I have to say, for those of us who are watching us outside, outside of Belém, that the logistics are a little bit challenging and complicated. So we had a last minute change in our panel, and I really, really, really want to thank Jerusalem from KPMG and Miguel from Iberdrola for the last minute acceptance to be part of this panel. So the idea today is to really have a frank conversation and see how and the extent to which the policies that are being implemented around the world are actually useful for companies and for delivering, and for access to transition finance, and, to what extent, looking forward, to what extent, we might need to, start converging on some of those elements. With that, let me start with the first question. And the first question, just to set up the context, is for you, Jerusalem. I said at the very beginning, really, why we're asking companies and financial institutions to disclose the transition plans is actually for them to facilitate their access to finance, right? So could you tell us about really what is the correlation between a credible transition plan and a better access to finance? And thank you so much.
Thank you, Elena, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you and with these colleagues in the panel. And it's a very good question because I think that in the past years, in a lot of conversations, we eliminated the word transition. So I celebrate very much to recover the transition concept when we speak about developing in companies, in big companies, but especially in finance. Because a lot of companies in the financial sectors, the capital providers, have a stigma about transition in some of 3 years ago or whatever. But today we are working a lot about transition because the context and the geopolitical context and geostrategic context and even the economic context is changing. Well, the importance is because in objective terms, the planetary limits have overview, so we need to act quickly and we need to plan this transition. So a lot of companies and a lot of sectors need to planify better the impact of the climate change in their companies and their impact in the world. So they need to develop a transition plan to contribute to the future for all the other sectors. But it's very, very important to analyze which kind of models the financial sector is using to evaluate that companies. And I think that models are changing too right now. This is my experience when we work with banks or with investors. Because 2 years ago, only 2 years ago, we was thinking about all the pure green agents was the winner, and the other was the losers. But today, we are seeing things in another perspective.
Right. Basically, what you're saying is that 2 years ago and before, we were concentrated on green finance, right?
Yes.
Well, it was really like the pure green.
Yes.
And now we're starting to really worry about that, the hard to abate sectors, what in the European taxonomy we call the transitional activities, those activities that have no replacement. So we need them, but we don't have yet a solution to really reach net zero, correct?
Correct. And if we only want to focus on green, on pure green, we have a broken step between today and tomorrow. So we need to establish the road to transit. So this is important. But companies in the financial sector are thinking about, well, in this difficult moment, in all the perspective, economical, geopolitical, wherever, in this difficult moment, we need to evaluate what is the risk for those that are pure green, that are bringing the future to the present. So, well, in the paper is very good, but maybe they have risks in the short term. And we are seeing other companies that are going to the future at the rhythm of the present. And maybe they have a risk in the long term, but not in the short term. So, in my opinion, a financial sector has to be very intelligent to prepare their models, because they must to include these two different risks when they evaluate companies in terms of transition.
Excellent. So what we're seeing is that, so basically the financial sector need that information and that visibility so they can integrate it in their model to start with.
Yes.
Right? And for them as well to be able to transition themselves and their portfolios, but also to provide the finance that companies need to transition. Now, moving to you, Miguel, and sorry for all of us that are coming from outside of Europe, if and any time it becomes a little bit EU-centric, yeah? But the big debate in Europe has been, oh my Lord, there's so much reporting, there's excessive reporting, there's no way, this costs us so much money, right? So we need to listen to companies that are saying this is too much, right? So we listen to it. But what I wonder, I have two questions that I ask myself. The first one is, how much are we asking companies? how much information that actually they don't need to transition. Because obviously, if you are committed to transition and you have to reach net zero, you need to calculate your emissions, right? If you cannot measure, you cannot manage. And set up a whole, a plan. So what is it, Miguel? Do you think that the current regulation is excessive? How much are we asking that actually is truly unnecessary? Yeah, and what's the way forward? Thank you.
Thank you very much for this last minute invitation.
And you for the last minute response.
Okay, so yes, I think that of course this is a complex issue where you will find, as you have just highlighted, different perspectives. From our perspective, as a company that has been fully committed for the last 20 years with an ambitious approach in energy transition and aligned with the climate agenda, you have already set the foundations for most of the transparency frameworks and indicators that you are mentioning. Because at the end of the day, if you are investing in renewables, networks, in all those aspects that are fully aligned with the 1.5 scenario, you have already set a science-based target, and you have already set within this framework a comprehensive plan and a set of investment drivers that are already aligned with this plan. Of course, this is a challenging aspect, and I am part of Iberdrola liaison delegate in different associations, industrial associations, global level, European as well, and I can speak with some colleagues that are struggling to meet some requirements. But from Iberdrola's perspective, we have been working for the last 2 or 3 years in implementing most of the requirements that have already been settled with the collaboration of external support in some cases, but our reports are working on this regard. What we think is important also to assess it carefully, to settle a levelized playing field in some way with the requirements, and use these transparency requirements as drivers of action in some way. I think these are, of course, I'm more focused in the policy side. We see sometimes that carbon pricing is a driver for action, no? Taxation is a driver for action, but for me, transparency and the governance connected with this transparency is also a driver of action. Now we are working on this field, and maybe later I will talk more.
Excellent. We are going to keep the governance for a second. Jerusalem, you want to add something very quickly?
Yes, very, very quickly. Transparency, of course, but which kind of transparency? Because sometimes we put transparency in the
end goal. As the end goal.
Yes,
right?
And in the top of 1,000 indicators.
Yes.
But we don't need 1,000 indicators. We need maybe 100 indicators or less.
Or less. And this is what we are going to get in a minute, because what I would love us to discuss now is exactly thinking about transition plans, what are the core elements, yeah? As you were saying, what are the core elements that we need, so that the investors and the financial institutions need, the policymakers need, but also companies to transition, yeah? And if we put to aside assurance, because obviously and the auditing, if we concentrate on those core elements, is there really an extra cost of regulation, of reporting, taking into account that a company needs anyway to calculate many of those indicators and needs to put in place and develop a plan? That is the question. But so for that, Nick, can we move to, you've worked on the Transition Plans Task Force. You have been working in this field for many years, let's say, for many years. So in your point of view, Nick, what are the key elements that a transition plan needs and that we need to have companies disclosing?
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And thank you very much for the early invitation. I was reading one of the classic writers recently, Ovid. He wrote a book called Metamorphosis. And he said, how do you make the gods laugh? And the answer is, tell him your plans. So we need to be recognizing that plans are a way to a solution. And I think really recognize where they differ from traditional climate disclosure. They build on this, so the TCFD framework, risks and opportunities, governance, metrics, and all that. But they're quite different in tone because they are much more about implementation. So within the UK, we had a process called the Transition Plan Task Force, which identified some key elements. The ambition, the strategy, the implementation in products, in processes, the engagement, and I'll come back to that, engagement with businesses, with suppliers, customers, policymakers, workforce, and then the governance and the metrics. I think some of the things that are coming out as being really, really important in that is the forward-looking piece, the use of scenarios, not just of net zero, but also on adaptation, resilience, and nature where it's relevant. I think in the implementation, clearly CapEx, and we already have a growing number of companies, I think about 11% globally, who are giving CapEx relevant numbers. OpEx can also be important, particularly when you're talking about workforce transitions. Policy frameworks, obviously, and I think in this moment of uncertainty, as you're talking about, there is this very heavy word in transition planning, which is dependencies. What are your dependencies? And I think that is probably going to be increasingly the most relevant part, maybe not quantified, but particularly for investors and other stakeholders, is what is your plan dependent on? Particularly policy, workforce, technology, and so on. Because we know that actually to get to 1.5, we do not have, that is not in the current regime. So what are the dependencies, and how are you going to work to change those dependencies? So I think the forward look, the strategy scenarios, the CapEx, and then a very close focus on this area, which might seem very academic dependencies, but I think it's going to be the key.
Can I follow up on 2 points, yeah? And I would love if anyone wants to jump in, yeah? So the first one is on the dependencies, right? So in the report, one of the recommendations we give, and our recommendations are all for policymakers, so just to contextualize, is to say, okay, in order to help companies precisely identify their dependencies, governments should develop, well, or different jurisdictions should develop sectoral policy roadmaps with technological roadmaps, and then ensure that the policy framework in those jurisdictions is consistent, because what we find companies sometimes find is that there are inconsistencies within different policies from different domains, and that will really be the core of then sitting down together and discuss those dependencies. Do you think that would be really useful? And I go back to, yes, and then Remco, and then you.
Absolutely, and I think we need to think of corporate transition planning and planning for financial institutions as part of a system-wide area. One thing, certainly in my country, the UK, we've been thinking about is actually, would it be sensible to think about actually potentially 20 or so companies which are systemically important for transition? And these would be the big banks, the big energy firms, the big construction companies, and you actually want to know how are for your transition in your country, Spain, Brazil, UK, India, how are these interlocking? How do these transition plans link together? And then you as a policymaker, where do you need to actually change? So I think that's
so this is a really good idea. So saying, what are a group of companies that they're key because of the weight, because they're high emitters, because of their position, and then work with them on those, roadmaps and have the discussion, right?
Because banks lend to every sector.
Absolutely.
So actually they need to be relevant for every sector. So I think you're right, the sector is important, the national is important, but I'm sure our colleague in Iberdrola we were discussing earlier, there are going to be many country plans.
Absolutely. So before going back to Iberdrola now, Remco, your views on this?
Yeah, just and thanks
Thank
very
you for
much
that.
also for the invitation, Elena. And
The earlier invitation.
early, perhaps not as early as Nick, but earlier. And congratulations on the report, and to you as for leading it, and for us, some of us for supporting it too, right? So it's been
Absolutely,
it's been a collaboration, and that's my point. It's collaboration, and I think if there's one thing that we know about decarbonization, but also about resilience building on the adaptation side, is that these challenges that's the challenge of our century, right? This is big stuff, like decarbonize. This is the third industrial revolution, whatever you want to call it. There's not one single actor in society that can deliver this by themselves. And at the same time, we found ourselves in a situation where, of course, certain companies, financial institutions do want to be leaders. And we've been promoting that leadership as Unipify a lot with our members. We've created these, as you know, these net zero alliances and platforms where financial institutions say, yeah, I'm going to align my portfolio and I'm going to with 1.5. And all of that was really, really useful. Part of the commitment has always been also, we will do all of this as long as also governments are delivering on their Paris agreements. Everyone's forgotten about that part. Even the finance sector CEOs, they now feel like they're between a rock and a hard place, and they say, I've committed to 1.5, but the system isn't there. No one's moving with me, and now I'm having difficulty justifying my actions to my own shareholders, etc. And this is and I think we need to re-emphasize this notion. It was never meant to be you alone. It was always meant to be you signaling, you going the first step, but then you also, with your leadership, inspiring your clients, your regulators, your governments to then do the second step together with you. And I think at this point in time, one of the concepts that we're debating quite actively, for instance, within Unipify, is the notion of conditional targets, conditional science-based targets. A lot of those targets are sector-specific, and you need sector roadmaps with sector policies, with sector technology, phase in and out.
Conditional on policy.
Exactly. So to say, I am the CEO of Bank X. I'm the CEO and I've set my 2025 target. By the way, today we're celebrating 10 trillion of assets, and the Asset Owners Alliance have met as of 2025 their mid-decadal targets, on average reducing carbon footprint of their portfolio by 20 to 30%. This is today. There's a progress report out. Just
Congratulations to them.
A blatant plug. It's on our website. But for the next generation of targets, for 2030, for 2035, is to say we want to continue. This is what I want my portfolio to look like in 2030, 2035. But I've been able to do it. But I've been able to do it so far without governments coming with me. I'm not going to be able to do it by 2030 because the investment universe is not coming with me. And so, but that's the narrative. We need to like that create a virtuous cycle of leadership.
Yes, thank you. Before going back to very quickly, Miguel, and then I'll go to the second point because I also want to discuss the CapEx that you mentioned.
Fully aligned with Kay because I have an example. Imagine that I am a Iberdrola, I have a plan to decarbonize my clients, industrial clients, but the regulation on networks, infrastructures, is not adequate in some places, and they don't have the infrastructure that should need to decarbonize their processes, electrify their processes. So these regulations would not be aligned with my plan and would be, in fact, a very important barrier. So it's very important to connect regulations, plans, and the advocacy you made.
It reminds me of some of the discussions we had on the taxonomy, which is how are we going to ask an actor that it works in the middle of, let's say, country X, if they don't have, for example, a proper waste infrastructure, how can we force them to comply with the waste management, criteria, which is relatively stringent of the taxonomy. So it's a really good point of we need to work together on the dependencies, but we need the roadmaps, we need those technological roadmaps. That's like the starting point for the discussions, right? So now to the point of CapEx, because and some of you that you know me, you know that I'm a big fan of capex and particularly taxonomy capex alignment, because really interesting in Europe, what we realize is that the biggest contribution so far that the taxonomy has made is precisely on that. It's precisely is guiding companies' capex and providing to investors not only the direction of travel because of the investments, but also the capex investment plan attached to those investments, and then they have to explain how does it relate to the transition plan, and why investors, when we interview them, you know, they told us that that is the nitty-gritty what they really like. First, because investors always want to look to the future, that direction of travel. But secondly, it's because they've seen in the past year some companies changing their transition plans, changing their targets without a real fundamental reason, like a real dependency change of policy. And they said, it is the capex and the capex plan that gives me the reassurance that those companies are putting their money where their mouth is. And that's what it really, really counts. So on that, I would go one step farther. I also think it's really important to disclose your investments in fossil fuels and in all those really harming activities, because we not only need the green, we need which investments you're making, right, that is actually expanding fossil fuels, yeah? And that will allow me to start really measuring or start assessing the extent to which there might be carbon lock-in those investments, yeah? So I wonder if you had any reactions to that. And for me, I would say, if I was back in Brussels, I would say, please keep those two indicators, yeah? So, thoughts, anyone?
So, I mean, the capex is interesting. If you look at one measure of, let's say, real economy companies, the investor initiative, the Climate Action 100 Plus, it looks at about 150 highly polluting companies around the world. And the three indicators which are weakest are the ones which I think relate to these very tough issues: capex, policy, and just transition. So these are about the really tough issues in companies. Capex, that is not your money, it's often shareholders' capital, or and this is about where you're signaling where your future companies come on, your products and investments and so on. Policy we've discussed, but that's hard. And then just transition, how are you going to be delivering on workforce development and so on. I think this is where we introduce a new feature into this discussion, which is how transition plans are evaluated. Because we know that in the real world, sometimes transition plans do not survive encounter with reality. And that's why and they change, circumstances change. So I think if we're in the context now that the idea of an orderly transition has gone, we're in a very disorderly world, then actually the evaluation of plans, and particularly capex, becomes super important. And I think that's one reason why I think we're now likely to see many more examples of stranding. To some extent, we're seeing green stranding, where maybe the policy has changed and people have overinvested in green, which is good from a climate point of view, but maybe not from a financial. But I think we will see, because of the technological drivers, more examples of high carbon stranding, particularly in LNG and other areas.
And you're absolutely right. And with less than 25 years left to reach net zero, let's be honest, if you look at the economic life of most infrastructure and assets, right, it is, I mean, what you invest now, right, any new infrastructure, any new plant, any new investment needs to be fit for purpose, or as close as fit for purpose as possible. Do you want to react, any of you? We'll move on.
I mean, just on this issue of the question of capex, I mean, I think at the end of the day, really what we're talking about is credibility, integrity, credibility, reliability of these plans. And, you know, within any plan, you're gonna have the stuff that is, you know, soft and fluffy and, you know, very prosaic, you know, very, you know, where you can obfuscate a lot and you can describe and you can kind of, you know, and you're going to have the quants. You that are black and white, and that add a real kind of clarity and a real robustness to the plan, and with that comes credibility and integrity, etc. This is why I'm, and some of those really difficult, hard stuff, to me, the CapEx figures is one. It's like either you have it or you don't, right? And you cannot you cannot explain yourself out of it by being smart in your explanations and your pros. Another one is the target. That to me, we should remember that this whole transition plan discussion originates from a target setting world. In the old days, we had companies and financial institutions and everyone under the sun setting their targets. They were aleatory targets. I'm going to do X, Y, Z. I'm going to do A, B, C. The numbers sounded great. Everyone's, oh, that's billions. That's great. Or, wow, that's thousands of tons. No one knew whether that was good or bad. And then came science-based targets to say, well, is a target good enough or not? Or not? Is it enough? Are you doing your part as part of a scientific? And that started adding credibility. And then the last point was, the last thing to be added was, okay, don't tell us just, now you have a science-based target, great, much better than a non-science-based target. That's the what, but for us to really believe you as your investors, stakeholders, regulators, tell us how you're going to achieve that target. But that's the sequence. And also that to me means that in addition to CapEx, very important, the hardwired stuff, the quantitative stuff. Absolutely, the targets are key, quantitative targets. And yes, there is everyone loves talking about eating more salad. No one wants to talk about eating less steak, and we need to be real about emissions are still going up, right? And
you're absolutely right. And on targets, just to say very quickly, and I'm going to go to you, Jerusalem, is that the targets are really important, but targets can change. Sometimes justify with reason, right? Or with a good justification. Policy changes, or any new technological, I don't know, innovation that has make you, allow you to go faster. But sometimes we've seen companies change them overnight without any justification, yeah? And we also have, and I want to go back to this point in a minute, is that the problem is that it's today's management, it's the same with governments, today's government, that makes the promise that the next top management or board or government, will comply with those targets. So there is a chance, sometimes to push into the future some of the hard work. So governance is really key. But before we go back to governance, Jerusalem, I wanted to ask you on moving into this world of stranded assets, the carbon lock-in. I believe that today we have a problem with companies' valuations. Like particularly in the energy sector for fossil fuel reserves, for example. Fossil fuel reserve, we know that there's 90% of the fossil fuels that they are in valuations that companies are putting out there as part of their assets into the future and the value. They're not going to be able to see the light, the sunlight, if we are to stay on 1.5. And yet, not only they're not being depreciated, they're being used to evaluate, to appreciate companies' values. What do you have to say about that, Jerusalem?
Yeah. Let me be a little disruptive.
Please.
And I can agree more with Nick about CapEx, for example, when you said about CapEx, like as a very important indicator. Because, and in this COP, we are speaking about the COP of the truth. But the moment of the truth is CapEx. So we do say a lot of things about your decarbonization plan, your transition plan, but your CapEx is not linked with this ambition. Well, you are deceptioning your stakeholders, but it's not truth. But maybe we need to amplify our vision. When we speak about value of the assets of the companies, it's not only an objective or technical topic, because in terms of dependencies, as we were speaking about dependencies before, we need to understand which kind of dependencies we have. And sometimes the transition plans are made by the technical persons, but not the political persons in the companies, not thinking about the relations and the diplomacy with their governments. For example, today, we have a lot of countries that have, in the past year, the middle of the world was to vote. 50% of persons voting past year. And we have seen a lot of changes in terms of governments and policies and the investment political plans. So if we have another public investment plan in my country or in the other country, and we are thinking about where I'm going to put my capex, maybe I am going to change my mindset, because again, we can think about to bring the future to the present or to go to the future walking in the present. So if we want to develop or to design a model to evaluate all these kind of things, technical issues are very important, the objective issues are very important, but political issues too. And it's a cycle. So you must influence in the policies to go ahead and speed, but you must to be consequent with your political scope. So for finishing my answer, if the model doesn't include the intangible aspects like policies or like stakeholder expectations or geopolitical risks or geostrategic risks, we are developing a non-very good model. So this is the reason why we are seeing today in a lot of companies that geostrategic, geopolitical risks are including not only the boards, even with special committees in the boards, and of course in some technical models to evaluate the assets. So it's so different.
Yeah. So could I, if I summarize, and I understood correctly, is we need on one hand, absolutely, the CapEx investments, the CapEx plan and so forth. We need the external dependencies, right? And the explanations. But we also need to start moving, to start changing accounting rules to really, for companies to appreciate or to depreciate their assets that might get stranded, right? Or the value of assets, maybe depending on the scenario case. Is that something?
Yep, it's very good. We must to develop different scenarios, taking into account not only environmental technical aspects, but your strategic aspects too. And trust is a very important concept in this context. For example, to influence in capital providers, you must demonstrate that you are doing, that you are thinking, and you are, and it's in your plans. So trust is very, very important, and sometimes we devaluate trust, we devaluate intangible, we devaluate diplomacy.
And let's be honest, the ones who need to maybe rethink their valuations are actually the investors, right? And the sell side in particular, they might need. One thing I hope that we all agree is that the one type of emission disclosures that we are not seeing, that we should see, it's the potential emissions of all those oil and gas reserves that they are in companies' accounts. So what are those potential emissions, the inclusion of those emissions, if I see the light? Do you want to respond to that? I saw you. If not, you want to respond? Yeah.
I want to respond to that because in 2010, an organization I helped set up, Carbon Tracker, published a report exactly on this. So there has been some progress, but I think what is interesting is this gets us into questions of fundamental accounting. And I think important for companies with fossil fuel reserves and also fossil fuel dependent assets particularly assets we may not think about as being vendors, shipping companies, ports, grids, that they are very clear, and the auditors of the accounts are very, very clear about value at risk for those assets.
Excellent. So before we move to governance, Miguel, do you want to react as a company and a representative also of a network of companies to what we've seen, what we discussed so far, and then we move to governance?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, at the end of the day, I think Jerusalem has also highlighted this. Sometimes if you develop a plan and it is not at the core of your strategic plan, it's not at the core of the decision-making process of your company, you in some way will not develop a robust plan. In our case, for example, I was very happy. I was in New York Climate Week, and at the same time it was being presented in London, our new strategic plan for 2025-2028. It was an investment of 58 billion euros in these 3 years, 37 billion to networks, to support electrification of other sectors, etc., and the rest to renewables. So I was very happy because at the end of the day, you are walking the talk, and it was easier for me in some way to talk about my climate plan because it was backing what I was saying that was a key driver of my plan. I was saying renewables and networks are two key drivers to deliver in this plan.
And can you tell us what is your CapEx alignment with taxonomy, please?
Yes, I think you already know, but I think around 90%, according to my colleagues that are involved in the topic. But at the end of the day, if you have been working on this and you are, I think my financing colleagues all will tell me, we have issued more than 28 billion of green bonds, and we have a framework to report on all the details of these products with agreements, etc. So you should be aligned in some way, because if not, you cannot go with this kind of instruments.
Absolutely, and I'm going to take advantage to tell our audience that is what has been really interesting in Europe is that we're starting to now see sell-side analysts that prove that there's a correlation between the taxonomy alignment, so positive taxonomy alignment, with market performance. So the good news is that the system works. We know that we need to simplify, particularly the do no significant criteria. We are working on simplifying the reporting. That's definitely, a must. But what is really interesting is to see that the mechanism that was thought of that big jigsaw and the taxonomy helping to access cheaper capital, because at the end of the day, that's what it is. It's about providing the opportunity for those companies that are making the effort to access cheaper capital. But let's move to governance. Renko, one of the things that in the early, the first draft of the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive that we are already missing was the duty of care for directors. So they had two things that were really interesting in that directive. The first one was around the duty of care for the directives, the top management and the boards in terms of the climate goals and sustainability goals. And at the same time, it included the need for aligned incentives. So basically, we're talking about variable remuneration, with the transition plan, with their goals, yeah? That was gone. But can you tell us to what extent, why is governance so important, and what would you, from a financial, if you put on the shoes of an investor, what would you require companies in terms of the climate governance?
Yeah, thanks. And then again, I mean, it goes back to what we've been discussing all along, actually, which is truth, and credibility and integrity. And if you're putting a plan out there, as a CEO, as a board, etc., to your shareholders, to your stakeholders, the question will be, is that a plan at the core of your strategy, of how you see your business developing, yes or no? And that's really important information for your stakeholders to know. Is this really your plan, or is this a communications exercise, right? And I think this is where some of these, my personal opinion is, some of these regulations, etc., to put more emphasis on duty of care and responsibilities there, I think makes a lot of sense. I mean, it also helps with tragedy of horizon, right?
Absolutely.
And that is obviously, you know, one of the fundamental challenges that we face on sustainability and sustainable finance anyway. That, you know, what we say we want to, what very often corporates and others say that they want to do in the future doesn't add up in terms of what they're doing in the short term. And so they're never going to, if in the short term you don't do what is needed for you to achieve your long-term objectives, you're not going to achieve your long-term objectives, even if you speak about that a lot. So I personally am very sympathetic to all of this, and I think many responsible investors would also be vis-a-vis their investee companies, even if this is not as part of the CSDDD package, you know, regulator or not, I don't know. I think there's an emphasis that it gets put on governance and long-term governance. But I think you were also asking about governments, and I think we're discussing also, you know, what is it, you know, we're discussing transition plans, the role of regulation and transition plans, and I think it's really important. But I also want to raise one point, which is that, of course, you know, at the end of the day, whether a company can really implement, you know, a very ambitious 1.5 transition plan, and we've been discussing it. There are these dependencies around them, and many of the conditionalities, and many of the conditions are just not in place yet. So we're seeing a lot of very good transition plans, very honest transition plans, but where we need to ask ourselves, you know, are the economics and the real economy there to deliver on those, right? Are we at a point where we are internalizing the carbon externality enough so that, you know, the capital really can go into these things? We can channel the capital away. In Europe, it may be the case to a certain extent because we still have things such as the EU ETS and, you know, industrial policy packages, etc. But worldwide speaking, that's where still, you know, I think we need to get, yes, the good regulations in place for the credibility of transition plans, but that's not going to take us anywhere if at the same time we're not looking at the sectoral roadmaps, the regulations there, internalizing the externality, and just making sure through real economy policies that risk-return ratios for Paris-aligned investments become a lot more attractive and compelling than risk-return ratios for non-Paris-aligned investments. And that's the world. That's not going to happen by itself because we're looking at a market failure. That requires policy. And if it's not a carbon price, then it's a feed-in tariff, and it's not a feed-in tariff, it's a phase-out of the fossil fuel subsidy. But we need to work also on a lot more focus on that. Without that, even the best intended transition plans are not going to deliver.
One of the things I believe that we learned through the process, you know, through the writing of this report and the research behind it, and is that there is no holy grail, yeah? And one of the problems we had in this space is that, you know, that now it's all about transition finance, now it's transition plans, now it's only taxonomy, and all our expectations, right? We put all the eggs in one basket. I would argue that we need everything, right? And we need a combination of tools and policies and work and at the same time, because literally we have no time, right? But if we, and I'm gonna quote you, Remco, if this is the biggest challenge of the century, shouldn't we make boards and top management responsible for the targets they set and for achieving the target with all the conditionality included, right? Because if I say, this is the target I'm going to achieve, right? This is why short-term targets are so important, because it's in the lifespan normally of a board or a CEO and of a CEO, and, you know, these are the dependencies. It depends, my achievement on that depends on all these things. But if that happens, I'm responsible. Nick, what do you think?
I think that's an obvious point, and I think going back to the TCFD, again, core part of TCFD is governance and the responsibility of the board to accept the goals and targets. And I think this is where we started at the beginning. I think the first question was about the relationship, transition plans, and capital providers. I sense that there is much more of a focus from investors who are concerned about the transition to be thinking about not just putting down special resolutions, but actually particularly identifying particular directors and voting against particular directors if the company is obviously not showing that actually it is fulfilling its responsibilities. So I think there are consequences of poor governance of transition.
If I may just complement what you say, you're absolutely right. My concern is the non-listed companies, because when it comes to climate change and sustainability, why should listed companies be more responsible and more accountable than non-listed? For me, this is why behavioral regulation and what the added value of the due diligence directive put it on the plate, which is, put the responsibility where it should be. Yes, Remco.
Just another thought. I mean, I completely agree with what you were saying, and perhaps I think we have many big challenges at the moment. Perhaps just saying climate change is the only one was perhaps an exaggeration on my part. It's one of the big ones, but it's not the only one. It's not the only one. And I agree with what you're saying in terms of, well, if so, then should not, the actions that we take and the actions that we expect, leading company boards, to make, should they not be stepping up? And I agree with that. The one point that I crosses my mind is, of course, there's not only the dependency between the private sector, and their regulators, and what within their jurisdictions, like do we have the steel policies that we need? Do we have the carbon pricing? That's one dependency. There's also, of course, the dependency, which is the intergovernmental dependency. It's like how much, again, it's the notion of collaboration. How much can just one jurisdiction, one country, kind of do for how long? Can it be ahead of the rest of the pack? Is there not also a dependency between countries needing to walk in advance on this in lockstep to a certain extent, right? In the same way that investors can only walk this in lockstep with their investee companies, and so forth. So I think there's that dependency there, and obviously that's what this process here is all about. And of course, we need to acknowledge that at this particular point in time, international collaboration on climate change is suffering. Hopefully that's just a transient, and we'll get back to more full collaboration. But I think that's one thing not to forget.
Absolutely. Jerusalem, you wanted to come back to make a comment, please.
Yes, about governance. Because in my experience as KPMG advisor, we pass a lot of time with the boards. And in my experience, we have found that maybe there are companies that are doing things not very well, maybe. But in the most of the cases, we have found that boards are very concerned about the pledges that they are doing, because they know that they are responsible about them. Maybe sometimes there are not consequences if they change in the middle of the road their pledges, because the context is different, and maybe because they hadn't the enough data available for them to prepare the pledges. This is a reality too. So, in my experience, companies are trying to do their best effort to establish pledges, maybe without the best information available for them, and they are trying to be consequences about them. Some companies have been very, I don't know how to say it, but without very realistic objectives, and they have tried to say to their stakeholders, we have a commitment with the future, and maybe their pledges are not real and are not comfortable. But the most of them have thought a lot about their pledges.
I'm going to quote Miguel on that one, because Miguel, there was a moment that you made a very good point. We said, actually, regulation is there not for the good the goodies, not for those companies that are making efforts, they're there for the laggards and level playing field. So just to say that that is the intention of the regulation. The regulation is there for ensuring comparability and that we all, progress together, but particularly to pinpoint the laggards, to push them a little bit more, yeah? I'm conscious about time, and I don't want to finish this panel without talking about resilience, nature, and just transition, because it's always been really important, yeah? The interdependencies between mitigation, resilience, nature, and just transition, they're obvious, right? Right now, the science, if something we have learned over the past years is that. But today, now that we have learned that the overshoot is inevitable, it's even more important, right? Because the consequences of the overshoot, some of the consequences might be even irreversible, and it's going to hit in particularly nature, those interdependencies. Nick, you've worked a lot on this. Can you tell us a little bit, what is your perspective in terms of the policies around that, your thoughts, and then if anyone else wants to jump in afterwards?
So I think if we're looking at transition planning for companies and financial institutions.
Yes, we're still on transition planning.
We're still on plan. Then clearly this has evolved. It started with net zero, and now it's called climate transition planning. So planning for adaptation resilience, not just in terms of net zero, becomes important. Nature comes in because we cannot deliver net zero or adaptation without investment in natural assets and so on. And there was recently some very good guidance from the TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Disclosures, on transition planning. So that's coming along. And then the third lesson is that actually we can't do net zero adaptation nature without people. So I think that is one area where I'm seeing some really quite positive areas. Reports that have been launched here, particularly on skills and workforce, and again, that horrible word, dependencies, that if Miguel's going to deliver all that capex in grids and renewables, you also need to have a workforce trained at the right time and all the rest of it. So I think that's the lesson. The good thing about that is that we can then have a rounded view. The tough thing is then that essentially becomes a sustainability plan for everything. And so I think the key thing with planning is the prioritization. It's prioritization and the materiality for the success and sustainability of that business. So I think within that, we've got to make sure that dealing with those combined issues, net zero, resilience, nature, and people, that leads to a prioritization in a strategy.
You're absolutely right. And particularly now where there's this feeling of overload, that companies are overloaded by demand. So how can we navigate that prioritization? Remco.
I mean, this is also very live discussion at the moment in UNEP-FI, because yes, there's one topic after the other, and our members tell us, we only have this size of a team, and my board has only, this amount of mental capacity for all of this. What do we do? I think a lot of the answer is prioritization, and I think a lot of, how do you prioritize will depend on where are you in the world and what sectors are you exposed to as a financial institution. You put those two things together, and pretty quickly you will see, actually, I don't know, Denmark, energy, it's renewable by now, so I think it's probably more the nature comes on top. If you go to another sector in the other part of the world, that list of priorities really is a matrix of sectors and regions.
Miguel, you want to jump in? We ran out of time. I mean, we passed the hour, but if you're not in a hurry, we'll finish this round and we might ask the public if they have any questions. If you are all okay, you're not rushing to any... Now, okay, perfect. Miguel.
Very briefly, with resilience is the same as with mitigation. If you are aligned with a business strategy, you have to make these decisions, this assessment within your business area. For example, in Network for Us, there is not someone isolated making decisions, assessment on resilience. Is the team that is in the business of networks. They are sizing the grids, introducing digitalization, some tools to be able to adapt these extreme weather events and to have a better response. This is at the core of the business.
Perfect. Jerusalem, you want to add something?
I think I agree, totally agree with Renko about the prioritization and about the opportunities too. I think we must focus in opportunities and in the value for companies, for governments, for the capital providers, thinking about the future is in the decarbonization context, and we must adapt our initiatives to go ahead to that point. And prioritization is capital, and materiality must be the tool that help us to do this prioritization. And as you said before, maybe you can face all the aspects, but if you face the two aspects that are relevant for you, you are doing a lot.
Excellent.
I would just add one sentence, which is
Of course.
dual materiality, please.
Yes.
Nick, I don't want to finish without one last question, a more political question, and this question is for you, Nick, is that despite the fact that, and we have all the evidence that resilience has been ignored in the past, right? And that we have a problem on finance and resilience. It seems to me sometimes in the debate that because resilience is more politically correct in the current juncture, there's a lot of, I fear that a lot of the debate and discussion is moving to resilience, where I would argue that the best investment in resilience is that made in mitigation, because it's like when it comes to health, the prevention is the best. You need to do the rest of investments in resilience, but never, 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 never at the expense. We need a lot more in resilience, but a lot more in mitigation. So it's not either or.
I mean, if we don't reduce our emissions to net zero, no amount of adaptation expenditure is going to deal with that real loss and damage for developing countries and causing real harm to billions of people. So the two things are not trade-offs. I would like to maybe end with a question of hope, or a moment of hope. And I was really inspired by what you were saying, Miguel. I think we can actually see that we've had a process with a number of companies now where if we took a soccer analogy, we are in the second half of the game. And we're winning. And we are scoring goals. And maybe the other team is fighting back, and maybe they are kicking us in the shins. But the referee's going to intervene. And I think we need to take heart from that. The second is, if you look at the map, particularly in terms of implementation or commitment of the ISSB, which has transition plans, the number of so-called emerging countries which are signing up to this.
Yes.
So it's not just a European discussion.
Of course.
And if we're thinking about the big debate here at COP, it's about the 1.3 trillion for emerging developing countries. So I think we can take heart that actually, for a number of countries, actually we are beyond halfway in terms of the transition. And so transition planning has worked, and that we're seeing significant signals of support in the so-called emerging markets.
You're absolutely right. And let me reiterate what the report says. The report says not only that 3/4 of all the policy, in this area that has been adopted last year has been in outside of North America and Europe, but also that in many of the global South countries, so-called global South, there's been a lot of innovation, and part of that innovation we found it precisely in these areas, in nature, deforestation, in resilience, in just transition. We've seen on taxonomies, we've seen the resilient taxonomy, including, racial issues, including deforestation, as well as the Colombian. We've seen Rwanda doing a deep dive on resilience. In fact, I have approached them to say, to meet, we said, we need to talk about, because we want to learn from your resilience taxonomy, which is much more developed. So I think there is the bottom line is that you're absolutely right. You know, there's a lot going on in developing countries, a lot of the innovation, but also, you know, as Renko was saying, we need to collaborate much, much, much more between policymakers and companies, but also between policymakers and companies across the world. So with that, big thank you for an excellent discussion. I hope you really enjoyed it. We learned a lot, you know, and a special thank you to all the panelists, you know, but those who join us at the very last minute, you know, maybe they deserve just a tiny more, you know, appreciation. Thank you.
Thank you.